Hey folks, welcome back to the show. Such a pleasure to have you here today. My guest today is a repeat guest. I would have to say she's probably one of the favorites of this show. Every time we have her on, the response is massive. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Yurth, and she is a wealth of information, no matter what the topic around longevity, epigenetics, peptides, you name it. And we get down into a lot of those topics today. But before we jump into that, of course, I want to thank you for being here. And I would love to encourage you, especially if you're new to this podcast, I want to tell you about my website, natnidham.com, where you can go to sign up for my newsletter and learn more about my private membership community. So I know that there's a lot of new listeners. The podcast has just exploded over the last little while. We've been hitting the top 5 nutrition podcasts in all of the United States. So for those of you who have been with me from the beginning, thank you. And for those of you who are new, welcome, welcome. Now, let's talk about our guest. Have you ever sifted through a mountain of health advice only to feel even more lost than when you started? Well, this is where our repeat guest, I think this is probably the 3rd time she's been on the podcast, Dr. Elizabeth Yurth, comes to the rescue. She guides us through aging research with her knowledgeable insights. And in this episode, we discuss anti-aging medicine, the pitfalls of research bias, and gender discrepancies that totally muddy the waters of scientific studies. We talk about the need for validating scientific claims. When theory meets practice, the truth can totally be surprising. And we share firsthand experiences from clinical work, revealing how animal studies fare once they reach human testing ground. So overall, we dive into the heart of longevity, where social connections and stress-free living can be the piece that makes all the difference. Overall, we explore the health. Sorry, Matthew, I'm redoing that sentence, obviously. Overall, we dive into the heart of longevity, where social connections and stress-free living are crucial. Dr. Elizabeth Yurth is the co-founder and chief medical officer of Boulder Longevity Institute, where she has been providing tomorrow's medicine today to her clients since 2006. Dr. Yurth has extensive training in longevity, epigenetics, nutrition, bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, regenerative peptide treatments, and regenerative orthopedic procedures. Now, to connect with Dr. Elizabeth Yurth, you can go to her website, which is boulderlongevity.com. You can follow her on Instagram at Boulder Longevity Institute. They also have a YouTube channel, and I can tell you that it will be well worth your while. Now let's dive into the episode. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Betsy Yurth. Can I call you Betsy?
You can.
Okay.
We've known each other long enough.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much. You and I, literally, we just chatted for you guys, like probably 45 minutes. We didn't even mean to. It's always really good to sit there and talk to you and catch up. And so I'm really thrilled to be on your show again.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled that you're here. So we've got like just the best conversation which we've had, as Elizabeth just said, but we didn't talk about all of it. I kept cutting her off saying, no, let's save that for the podcast. No, wait, no, let's save that for the podcast. So we're going to talk about today. We're really going to talk about aging, in many different aspects of aging. And I think that, you know, the world is moving into this frenzy about this whole concept of reversing biological age, of, you know, anti-aging drugs that reverse it, like stop you from aging, slow down aging, and then the big nut, reverse aging completely. And so it's getting messy. It's super exciting, and it's getting messy and noisy at the same time. So one of the things we started when we started talking is you talked about where you get your information. When you're looking for information as a doctor in this field, when you're looking for information, where do you go? Where do you look? And where do you not look? I know you're not looking on Instagram, but where do you look?
This is super hard, guys. And I think it's probably the hardest thing for Nat and I, and probably for everybody, like all you guys who are biohacking, is where do you get your information from? And is it valid information? And that unfortunately pans into my hope is people are getting it from research, but is research okay? And is the research actually giving us good information? So I base everything on multiple research, studies. So I'm reading all the time. I'm looking at research all the time to try and figure out what is good, what is bad. One of the hard things is that it's very, very difficult to trust research. And first of all, most of it's in worms and mice, right? Maybe that transfers into humans. We hope that at least to some extent it does, right? But we don't know. We're making our best guess. We think it will. We think that probably that research does overlap into humans, at least to some degree. Maybe not 1-to-1, but at least to some degree. So I think that's one of the things. The other thing is that, and you'll see this in some studies, that there's always a big difference, male-female difference, right? So data that sometimes something works might work better in a male than a female, or vice versa, in a female than male. So you have to actually look at that data too, and is this really good for both sexes or not? And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take it, but it does mean you need to be aware, if I'm female, that drug might not work as well for me.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing is, how do you trust research, and do you trust research? And it's become kind of a iconic paper now. It was written a long time ago now, probably, 15 years ago, by a guy out of Stanford, John Ioannidis. And he wrote this paper that was called "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And it was a really, unfortunately controversial paper, but he really got down to the nitty gritty at analyzing research papers. And the first thing he found is that 70 to 80% of published research is positive. Meaning, if I go set out to look if my new favorite supplement is going to work, 70 to 80% likelihood it's going to work. Okay. I did research for many years, and still do, but more in the clinical setting. But I will tell you, it is very easy to make research show what you want to show. And so if my goal is, I've been spending my life trying to prove that a drug or a supplement is wonderful, I can probably make it look pretty wonderful just by selecting my research or my data in a certain way, right? So that's one of the problems. And the other problem is, really, most people don't publish negative research. It becomes uninteresting, right? So most of the research that actually gets accepted for publication is positive research. So when you guys read, oh my gosh, this drug is the next best thing, this is what's going to stop aging, is it, or was number one, it very marginally positive? So you have to go and look at all your p-value studies, and you have to be able to understand statistical significance. But most of p-value measures, being reported in scientific research, is probably not looking at it. If it's a positive p-value, it's probably very minimally so in many of those studies when you actually look at it. He also really, showed that, and he showed this very definitively, that you can construct a statistical model which indicates that almost all, and maybe as many as 90% of research studies, are falsely showing something that they actually don't, and it's not reproducible. So what do we do with that, right? If our best bet is to hang our hat on research, and yet we can't trust the research, what do we do? So when I'm looking at aging drugs or supplements, I really actually like, and maybe some of your listeners will argue me on this, but I have to do the best with what I can. And so I go to the National Institute on Aging's Intervention Testing Program. And the reason I like this is because it's kind of independently funded. So these guys aren't actually trying to sell a drug or show that a new supplement is going to work. But what they did is they took 3 different big institutions, University of Michigan, Jackson Laboratory in Maine, and University of Texas Health Science Centers. I hope I'm right on all those, in San Antonio. And they each would take these studies and reproduce them with the exact same setting. Everything was controlled in terms of the environment that these mice lived in terms of the temperatures, in terms of the food. Everything was very, to a pinpoint, controlled. And they also used massive amounts of data. So they used 1,000 mice for each of their studies instead of maybe 100 mice for each of their studies. And then each of the institutions would carry out at the exact same time, the exact same study with the exact same conditions, using a massive amount of mice data. And if they could not reproduce the study across all 3 institutions with similar data, they consider that a failure, right? Which makes sense. If I cannot reproduce data, it probably is skeptical data.
Yeah.
And they've studied massive amounts of drugs. When you go back and look at the things they've studied, massive amounts of drugs and supplements. And so far and they continue to study, but they've really only found about 7 that have truly met their criteria for success. Meaning all 3 institutions got very similar data. It was positive enough, not minimally positive, but really markedly positive. So a little above typical statistical significance. And that it actually was something that they would say, we can recommend this to be helpful for aging, right?
Right. And I just want to interject here because definitely, and you still get people, somebody just commented on a thread recently, well, this is all very interesting, but I don't have ears and whiskers or a tail, and therefore this means nothing to me. And you said that, right? I mean,
Right.
data from mice doesn't necessarily carry over to humans. But I think what's interesting about the conversation with you and doctors like you is that you're looking at the data the best that you can. You're making a call on whether this is something that you think that your patients might benefit from. But then you move into real world kind of clinical research, right? Which
Right.
is not keeping everybody in the same box with the same light and the same food. But in the real world on humans, is this playing out in some way, shape, or form? So it's not a 10,000 people, 50-year study, but it's kind of like in real time, what are we seeing in terms of translation into
Yeah,
humans?
I think that is really an important point because there are so many things that I like, oh my God, that is amazing.
Yeah.
And then I put it into my clinical setting and half the people had some kind of bad side effect from it. I'm like, okay, it wasn't so amazing. It's why people always ask me, because I do a lot of teaching, a lot of lecturing, a lot of writing, are you going to just leave clinical practice because, you probably are better off going out and doing this? And I said, unfortunately, my clinical practice is my testing ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I don't see people responding and how people react to things, and, because I've become very disillusioned with things that I had a very positive, I was like, oh my gosh, this looks amazing. And then repeatedly, I would just keep having the same issues, and I'm like, okay, this is just not going to work. So it's my testing ground. And I think you make a really good point there. Is the nice thing about having a clinic and treating patients is that you can sort of see those intangible things that aren't really looked at. That, none of the mice felt nauseous for 8 hours out of the day. And, and yet half my patients feel nauseous for 8 hours a day.
Or if they did, they couldn't say.
Right. They didn't tell their researchers, So, so I think that's really important, is that we really do have to look at, and it's a hard thing because that, that's objective or subjective data. Is my patient actually feeling good? Am I actually feeling? But we're also looking at labs and we're looking at subtle findings which we'll get to a little bit later. But, what can we look at to say, are we actually making positive improvements in these people? So I think that is a really important point, that you've got to take things, we have to take the data that we have, and that might be in mice and worms because the human data is very hard to get. But then we have to put it into our clinical testing ground and see if it's panning out and working, right? Yeah. And some of those things are really hard to figure out, like rapamycin. Is rapamycin truly affecting aging? By all the studies, it looks like this should be the anti-aging drug, right? And if you look at pathways and you understand pathways, it looks like it should have those effects. We don't know. We really don't have that answer. We have to trust things the best, but there's things I'm willing to take that risk on because they look pretty safe.
Yeah. I have a story about rapamycin. So my rapamycin story is I've been sitting with a couple of boxes of rapamycin for a couple of months. And although I'm a self-defined biohacker and all that stuff, I'm actually a relatively cautious person. So I've kind of been sitting with it. And finally, in the new year, I started taking it. On Sundays, I would do 4 milligrams of rapamycin, which is a relatively low dose, but I'm not a big person. And, I didn't want to go overboard. And I kind of forgot about it, and I did it every week. And so meantime, I'm working with these guys in Singapore that are analyzing my Aura Ring and my 8 Sleep data from a back end perspective. And so they're able to dig into the data and look at very different metrics. And a few weeks, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks before I went away on holidays, the guy that I talked to sends me a note and says, "Hey, Nat, what did you start doing on February 9th?" And I'm like, And I'm sitting there going, are you kidding me? Like, do you know how often, like, I try this or I try that, or, you know, because I'm constantly getting
Nothing
stuff in the
changes,
door.
right?
Everything's always changing. And I'm like racking my brains. And I'm like, I could not come up with anything. And he said, well, there's something you started on February 9th that has made a massive difference. Like, your inflammation's gone way down.
Wow.
Like, and so anyway, so I get off and I'm sitting there going, oh my God, like,
What I do, right?
surely I've got to remember what it was. And all of a sudden I had this epiphany. It was the rapamycin.
Wow.
I went back to my notes, and sure enough, that was a Sunday, and that was the day that I started taking it. And he said, it's a complete game changer.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be the same for everybody else.
Right.
But, you know, in my N of 1, for whatever reason, this stuff completely hits the mark for me.
Right. And that is the hard thing. Like, you know, I take rapamycin. I haven't seen any change in my labs. I don't feel any different, but I'm taking it because I still have faith in it based on the studies that are out there that this is doing something for my longevity. Yeah. But I would love to have seen all my Oura Ring data get better, but it didn't.
Well, my Oura Ring has since bit the dust. So
if you put it on its little charger and then you pound it like this,
you know, it's totally let me down. But the good news is there's a lot of new ones coming out.
There is a lot of new stuff coming out. Yeah,
there'll be something else. Anyway, so that was, sorry about the sidebar, but I just thought it was really interesting.
Story, and it is. I mean, that is why we have to test these things out on ourselves a little bit, and get what data we can.
Yeah. Anyway, so you were saying, so there's the 7 drugs. So there's 7 drugs that have really, or 7 compounds
so far that they've kind of panned out. And there's, you know, they're continuous tries. So rapamycin 1, the anti-diabetes drugs, acarbose, and some of you guys know about acarbose combined with rapamycin seem to have actually, and these guys are studying independent drugs. They're not mixing them together. So we do know there's some synergistic effects to some of these drugs that if you take them together, they may have better effects than either one separately. But they did find that acarbose was beneficial for longevity across the board, males and females. And then the anti-diabetes drugs like Jardiance and Invokana, which are what we call SGLT inhibitors, and those also panned out. And I've been using those for quite some time in my practice, particularly Jardiance for longevity stuff. And I do see some good benefits from it, aside from glucose control. But
because I was going to say, how much of it has to do with just glucose control, which naturally lowers inflammation, and just like glucose is a fairly upstream negative in terms of health.
Yeah, I think there's more to the story than that, right? Because in both these drugs, much like semaglutide, if you have pretty normal glucose, they don't really markedly affect. Like if you look at your CGM on these drugs and you really are pretty normal anyway, you don't see a big drop in your glucose. So even without seeing on CGM monitoring that these people have any dramatic change in their glucose, you'll still see some other changes, like things that we look at, like the size of the cells, mean cell volume, or red cell distribution. With those are the little markers that we can look at for aging that are simple to look at, and you'll see some improvements in those with these. So I do think there is some benefits, and again, those are very low risk drugs as well. But acarbose is cheap and easy to get. It's an easy prescription and very cheap. The other two, not so much. They're expensive. You can get them compounded from some people for a little bit less, but they're not easy to get. They're much more expensive drugs. But acarbose is a simple kind of add-on to rapamycin, and it did show some significant benefits. So it was pretty high on their list of drugs that had some benefits. And then there was an antioxidant that I'm not actually all that familiar with, and you might be. It's called NDGA.
No.
For life of me, it's something like nor-dihydrogualurotic acid.
All right. You
don't quote me on that one.
For you.
NDGA. And it's basically a phenolic ligand that is from something called a creosote bush in Mexico. And it's also found in like the U.S. deserts, I think, like Arizona and stuff. In sort of ancient medicine and also in Indian medicine, it's kind of been used as a treatment for cardiovascular disease, cancer, renal disease, right? So they studied it, and very interesting, it actually showed very good anti-aging properties. Scavenges free radicals. It's probably one of the ways it works, but it was pretty significant. So it was one of the supplements that was pretty significant. I haven't used it, and so when I looked at their study on this, I thought I should start looking a little bit more into this, because I haven't seen it widely sort of advertised, and yet it came out very high on their list across all the institutions. In men, the sex hormone 17-alpha estradiol, not as much in women, but 17-alpha estradiol, which like Brian Johnson takes, I don't know where he gets that compounded, but you can, 17-alpha estradiol, which is different from just basic estradiol. It's a metabolite that you don't see high in most men. So that's one, again, more so in men than women.
In men.
Then,
and so how? Why do we think that is?
I don't know the mechanism of why. I think that the 17-alpha estradiol probably has some neuroprotective effects. So I think it's probably for brain aging and cardiac aging. When you look at some of the neuroprotective effects of these drugs, I think that's probably where it plays a big role. I haven't, because I can't, I don't prescribe it. I don't use it much. I can't really speak too much to it. But I do know it. There must be a way to compound it, since Brian Johnson seems to be getting it from somebody. So there must be.
He's going to get it from someone. Well, because it's interesting, because you've got all these guys taking estrogen blockers, right?
Right. I'm not a big fan of estrogen blockers, right? Because there's better ways to control. You need to control estrogen metabolism, but in general, estrogen is there for a very, very big reason in men, and it's very cardioprotective and very neuroprotective. And you really do not want to block estrogens in general. If it's sky high, something's usually wrong, right? Something is making you metabolize all your testosterone into estrogen, and you need to look at what I need to fix metabolically so I don't have that metabolic pathway, as opposed to just blocking estrogens. I will tell you, sometimes I use them because I just can't get these guys under control, and that to get enough testosterone in them that they start losing fat and being able to work out and things like that, I'll use them for a while until I get them more metabolically in control. So I will use them, but my hope is always to get these people more metabolically healthy, and they don't need the estrogen blockers. But yeah, those guys who are, you want a good healthy estradiol level, and then making sure it's going down into the right pathways is important. You can look at Dutch tests to make sure it's not going into 4-hydroxyestrogen, which is really bad for men for prostate cancer. So you want to make sure you use a Dutch test to make sure it's going down into a 2-hydroxy pathway. You can't measure 17-alpha estradiol. I don't think on its own. Maybe you can. Not familiar enough with how you measure that. So, but we have to trust that if the estrogen levels are a little higher, at least you're getting some of those benefits from it.
Cool. Okay. And then there
were a couple over the counter. So they actually looked at a couple of just over the counter things that, that were easy to get. So, and one of the ones they went after was meclizine. So meclizine is some of you guys who have had seasickness have taken this. It's an anti-vertigo drug. So lots of times you'll take meclizine if you're going to go boat and you're always seasick. You'll go along with a little meclizine for you. We use it post-surgery in people who have post-surgical nausea. You take some meclizine, but it's an anti-nausea drug, and it's a mTOR inhibitor. So it actually is a really good mTOR inhibitor, mTOR1 inhibitor that is simple and easy to get. Whereas rapamycin, you need a prescription, and meclizine is something you can get very simply and over the counter. And so that's one that actually panned out. It was much more in male mice than female mice.
Interesting.
And it wasn't dramatic. I think it was about 12% increase in lifespan, but it panned out as a positive effect. And then, what was the last one? Yeah, astaxanthin was the last one. Astaxanthin was the last one. And astaxanthin, as you guys know, is basically that's kind of a pink color that comes from the shrimp and crayfish. So eating more trout, krill, shrimp, crayfish, you get more astaxanthins. I take it as a supplement. I like it as a supplement. But that did show in animal models, at least yeast, worms, flies, mice, did show it had an improvement of about, I think it was about 15%. So that one was, was not minor. So astaxanthin, I think, has some benefits. It is a weak antioxidant. I don't like to take antioxidants continuously, so I do take breaks off my astaxanthin, but it's not as strong as some of the other antioxidants, so I think you're a little safer with it. I actually like it because it makes your skin a little bit darker, and it kind of helps age spots, so it actually has some kind of nice effects on skin too.
Yeah. Well, some people refer to it as internal sunblock, right?
Yeah. Right.
I mean, it's not exactly like your SPF.
Right. But it does have some very skin protective effects. And you'll see, like, if you have a lot of, dark age spots, you'll see those improve on astaxanthin. And then, interestingly, one of the things that we all sort of know and love was fisetin, and fisetin, they did not at all pan out in their research as being a positive effect through all the institutions. So a lot of us have really said, oh, ficetins are great. And, and I've seen a lot of the companies who are making these senolytic agents throw fisetin in, and they didn't study it with dasatinib. So maybe it would work better combined with something else. But in and of itself, it was not nearly as dramatic as these other compounds. So again, there's data to support it. But when it wasn't replicable across these institutions, I think you have to look at that data with some skepticism.
Right.
Does it not work? I can't promise that, but I took it off my list. I don't need another thing to take that may or may not work.
Yeah, for sure. Well, especially when you're taking isolated things. So fisetin was one of the bombs, or the unexpected kind of bombs. The other one, which I found really interesting, but maybe it has other benefits that people should be taking it for, was quercetin.
Right. Quercetin also, and again, I think this is another one maybe combined might have some benefits, but on its own did not show significant benefits. So I think, it is another one we have to look at with some skepticism. And again, I think some of these things have combined effects, and that's where some of this longevity data has to go, is in what drugs can we combine, because you're working on different pathways with different drugs. So it's not to say we should throw it all out, but I do think that if we have these other drugs, if we're being selective in where things we're taking, and I would encourage you guys that you can't take 5 billion supplements. And I see people all the time. I have, my biohacker patients who come with their 5-page list of supplements, and then I look at their liver enzymes, which are sky high because their poor liver is so taxed trying to metabolize all of these things. I think you have to be careful not to overwhelm your system with too many things, right? You can rotate things, you can do that, but you really have to be careful. So if I were to take things off my list, that probably would be one that I might not take, or take very intermittently, right? Until I get more data. Until I get more data. And again, you may talk to me next year and I'll change my tune, because now new research came out that was much more compelling. Or these guys did some further studies, with combination effects or things like that. So I think that I do think quercetin and probably fisetin do have some other benefits. I do think they have some other health benefits, from an anti-inflammatory effect. I don't know that we should hang our hat on them for longevity.
Right. Well, and you bring up such a good point. Maybe next year I'll be singing a different tune. And it's again, like, and I've said this before, if you meet someone who has planted a flag on a hill and refuses to budge and says, this is it, this is the thing, run for the hills, like run away, right? Because, as you're saying, and as we've been saying all along for as long as we've been talking here, is these are all moving targets. Like we're you get new information, you bring in the new information, you apply it, you see how it pans out. It's going to work better for some than others. There's, some might work better for men than women. But I've also even heard of things, and I see this more on the bioregulator world, where even in the literature, they talk about works really well for old people, doesn't do squat for younger people.
Yeah.
Right. On certain bioregulators for certain effects. And people forget that. I've got 30-year-olds saying, well, I'm going to take a Pidolon every single day for the rest of my life. And I'm like, well, you might not actually need it.
Right. You might not be there yet. Right.
Whereas, in elderly people who have lost their melatonin production or whatever the case may be, maybe we're going to see an effect. Yeah.
No, you're right. It's a complex field. And it's a really rapidly changing and growing field. And that's why it is, I just like you said, if anybody who's hanging their hat, and it's the problem, with medicine, right? It's what we all did for, medicine has not changed because we all are hanging our hat on the same things that we learned in medical school. I look at the medical students now are learning by far almost the same things I learned, and I went to medical school a hell of a long time ago, and the fact that they're still teaching the exact same things is frightening to me, right? Yeah. That because obviously there's been such a dramatic shift. So you have to, and yet doctors refuse to change because they're like, well, this is what I learned. I spent, goddamn 25 years doing this. I'm not going to change my behaviors on it. And you get it. If you built this, you spent hours and hours and buku money to build this beautiful house, and then somebody walked in and said, oh, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong, you're like, well, I don't care, this is all fine. So we really do have to stay really open-minded, and we have to keep reading, and we have to keep listening, and we have to keep saying, well, I did that for 5 years and actually it was the wrong thing. I always hate to tell my patients that. They're like, oh, well, last year you told me to take that drug. I'm like, yeah, changed my mind.
Unless the person sitting in front of you really benefited from that.
Yeah, they loved it. It works great.
Even if some literature comes along and says, actually, it's not that great. And yet, in this patient, because again, maybe there's other factors at play that haven't been identified, that weren't looked at in the study, that are at play with this person, that make it that for this person, they're rocking out. Like
Exactly.
it's the right thing for them. And I think that's where, you know, research will never be able to deliver all the answers because there are simply too many different variables in the world.
Yeah.
Like,
No, you're right.
that's where the
So all we can do is
as a clinician, this is where you help people in their N of ones.
Yeah. No, you're right. It is all an N of one experiment. And you're right. What works for one person might not work for another. And you're right. If somebody, you know, they're like, oh my God, I felt great on that. Then you're going to say, yeah, well, then keep doing it.
Well, you're not going to say, nope. This study just said, sorry about your luck.
But, you know, but I am always trying to keep my people panned down a little bit too, to say, yeah, let's only take the things that are benefiting you. And if I have them taking something because I thought it was going to be helpful in this realm, and now it's been proven that skepticism about that, then I will take them off that and move to the next thing.
Yeah, 100%. There's something that's come up a few times. And again, it's one of those things that people get all cuckoo about, is this whole idea of blocking mTOR. You know, mTOR has become the bad word in aging. We don't want mTOR. We want MK. We want this, that. And I'm sitting there going, well, wait. Number one, we kind of need muscle as we age. I'm just putting it out there. We may not want as much as a bodybuilder, but we need functional muscle as we're aging. But at the same time, just because I'm taking my 4 milligrams of rapamycin once a week doesn't mean that I'm not able to make muscle. And I feel like there's a lot of nuance that gets lost in that conversation. Do you want to address that a little bit? Because
so, you know, you're right. The world is a balance. Everything in our cell is a balance. It's why you don't want to take too many antioxidants, is because we need oxidative stress. So redox is a balance between reductive and oxidative stress, and it has to be balanced, right? When we screw that up, the cell is really smart. And we screw it up because we start taking all these antioxidants. Now we throw things into disarray. So the same thing's true about sort of mTOR and AMPK. You don't want to always be blocking mTOR and be in an AMPK state, because you won't be able to build muscle. You won't be able to build bone. You won't be able to actually recover very well. So maybe you'll live a long time, but you'll be frail and in a wheelchair if you just turn off mTOR all the time. So it's why you take your rapamycin once a week, right? That we're sort of turning down mTOR, and then we let it go back up, and we turn it down, go back up. Or in my practice, I'll do a lot of things where I'll be kind of working with people to stimulate mTOR for a few months and then, you know, bring it back down. So especially I'm working with like a bodybuilder population, things like that. That's, you know, going to be one of the things you sort of work with in the same realm. And so we have to always remember that the cell is in a complete balance, and mTOR and AMPK are no different, that you really want those balanced. And so anything that you're taking that's blocking mTOR, you probably don't want to do as on a continuous state. And if it's a more mild block, that might be okay. Don't know. I would always say these things that are mTOR inhibitors, you should probably cycle on and off of, let mTOR wake back up. It's why fasting and refeeding, you know, fasting, you're turning mTOR all the way up. What happens when you refeed? You turn it back up, right? It's that up and down, turning it on and off, that are so important. And so we really have to be careful not to, again, mTOR is horrible, let's just block it, live on AMPK for a while. You will run yourself to the ground and not be able to rebuild. And I actually have seen that. You know, I've seen women who have horrible osteoporosis, and I look at them and, you know, they've done everything that is more inhibiting muscle growth, right? That, you know, that's so longevity driven that they've inhibited muscle growth, and we turn to these frail little people. And the same thing's true about IGF, right? If you look at the IGF dilemma, then is high IGF bad? Is high IGF good? Because if I have super high IGF, yes, I may die shorter, but at least I have some muscle and I have some reserves. The long-lived populations that have super low IGF actually end up very, very frail. And if you look at people always quote, these tribes that have this IGF of 65 and 85, and they live for a really long time. If you actually look at them, they're very frail, and the elder people actually be carried around. I mean, so none of us want to live like that. No. So we need to have a balance of IGF. And even Longo, Walter Longo, who basically was very much on that low IGF crowd, now says, well, maybe as we age, we do need a little higher IGF, because we do need to have to rebuild muscle a little bit. So even he's jumped a little bit more onto that side of, it's not a bad thing to have this mTOR IGF driven now and then.
Well, even as a cycle, right? Like you're as you're talking, like it's as you could have periods of higher IGF and periods of lower.
Yeah, and lower,
IGF,
exactly.
Right? Like
go
I
up
think,
and down it, right?
So when you talk about, just to go back to rapamycin for a minute, like you were saying, so we're taking it once a week, so it's going to get blocked for a couple of days, then it's going to come back, and then it's going to get blocked. When you talk about cycling, would you say that people should stop rapamycin for like a month or so every 3 months, or is it okay?
Are we taking it once a week?
Hmm?
Yeah, I think if you're cycling on that once a week basis, I think that's probably fine, right? Yeah. There are people who believe you should cycle it differently. You should do it, 1 week out of every month. There's, if you look at Bioidentical, he cycles it differently than that even. So there's all these different recommendations on how we honestly don't know the answer to. We know you have to cycle is 1 day out of the week, or is it 1 week out of the month, or is it, 1 month out of every 3 months.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing this different ways, and we don't really have the answer to that. So I think most of us have kind of gotten onto the one day out of the week rule. Is it right? I don't know.
Anyway, I think it sounds kind of good, and if you pair it up with fasting and then you refeed and you you kind of,
like that day you take the rapamycin,
right?
You're lower caloric. You don't do your hard workouts on that day. That's probably a really good, sort of plan on how to use it.
Yeah. And you just
for me, I think if you're turning down mTOR for a full month, probably you are, and Bioidentical would argue this, but you are probably starting to get a little bit of immunosuppressant effects from it when you're doing it for that long.
Yeah, I would agree. That feels like it also feels unnatural. It doesn't feel like the body would do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like what's natural to the body is these pulses, these pushes and pulls, these highs and lows, the feast and the famine, like coming and going. And if you look at an ancient times when people didn't have a grocery store to go to, they might have been starving for a month and then feasting. And you might say, well, that's what we should be doing. And I'm like, well, but maybe that kind of culled the herd and some people just died. You know what I mean? Like it's
maybe weren't so healthy, right?
We don't necessarily want to replicate everything exactly, but the idea of pushing and pulling and cycling and pulsing, I think is you almost can't go wrong.
Agree
with that concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And you and I talk about this a lot, is that people should be cycling their supplements. They shouldn't be just continuously doing the same thing all the time. It really is not what your body is designed for, and it's going to screw things up. Again, try and remember that inherently our bodies are actually really smart, and they want to do the right things. And when we sort of disrupt that, we can actually sometimes do a lot more harm than good, even if the supplement looks like it has all these positive effects.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, we're just kind of barging in and saying, no, wait, let me do it. I have no idea what I'm doing here, but let me take over.
Yeah.
Okay. So this kind of brings us a little bit to this conversation around how we measure aging or how we think we're measuring aging beyond our birthdays, because, we've got this birthday concept, which is pretty well established. How many times around the sun have you gone? The whole 9 yards. But this whole now obsession with biological age testing, and people, you've got these people, and it's funny because I don't even talk about this stuff anymore about myself, because I've seen my biological age. It's generally pretty good. I've seen it go up and down a couple of times. And I'm kind of like, I'm now sitting back going, okay, so how much of an absolute is this? And every smart person I've talked to, including you, has said and kind of agreed, said, it's a bit of a construct we've created to kind of give people, I don't know why. I mean, I guess we have this obsession as humans that we want to know and we want to be able to turn things back. But let's talk a little bit about this whole idea of biological age clocks and how I've had people go into total slumps because they're like, oh, I got a bad biological age report, and they're really stressed. Like,
and that's interesting, because when you look at the number one predictor of longevity,
stress.
It's stress, right? Yeah. The number one predictor of how long you live is do you think you're going to live a long time? So now I gave somebody some data that said, oh, sorry, you're going to die in a year. Like, oh my God, I mean, so that just undid everything. Because if you look, if people actually think they're going to live a long time, they actually are healthier, they feel better, and they tend to live a long time. When you talk to old people, they never actually thought about their biologic age. They just thought, yeah, I just never thought I was going to die.
Yeah.
And they had great social connections, so they weren't sitting in their house, fasting all day long and making sure they took their supplements and wore their red lights. And so they never even saw any people because it took them 8 hours a day to try and do their biohacking routines. And so they have no social connections, low stress, a positive attitude. To me, some of these biologic age tests have taken all of that away. I just stressed somebody no end. And now they went to this vicious, like, oh my God, I'm going to do everything I can. And now they've sort of isolated and they're not doing a lot of the behaviors because those were better predictors than exercise, and diet was literally social interactions and happiness and feeling useful. So we have neglected that in doing these testing because that testing does nothing. And that was the number one predictor when you looked at age. So I think we have to, when you actually look back at the centenarians and what did they do, that was the across the board, what all of them had in common. So that's what we have to do is we have to look at these centenarians and say, what did they have in common? Usually it was a sensible diet and they did, some exercise, but it wasn't excessive exercise. So I think that's number one is we do have to sort of say, what are we doing with our patients when we're actually doing this testing all the time? We're giving them this data that sometimes is really scary and disappointing. And, unfortunately, doctors have been driven that way a little bit. Everything we do is a little bit to say, oh, okay, well, this is everything I might do might kill you. And so people have fear all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's number one, why I don't like them. But number two is I don't know if we really know what we're measuring. And I have a very good friend who's a pretty prominent researcher and I think brilliant. And one of the things he says is that, we aren't actually designed to stay the same. If you never learned, if you were exactly the same, like you thought the same way you did when you were 18, your body needs to learn. I don't do what I did at 18. Could my body do it? Maybe, maybe not, but I know I'm more sensible, right? I don't want to hurt myself. And at 18, I didn't give a shit. If I skied down a cliff and I broke my leg, it was like, nah, I'll be okay. Yeah, now I know that's not true, right? So there's behaviors we learn that are protecting us. The same thing may well be true at a cellular level. There are things that our cells are doing that are actually protecting them from all the stuff that they've been exposed to. They've actually have increased their resilience. So when I look at all this data that says, okay, well, the 20-year-old has this picture, and I want my 80-year-old or 50-year-old to have that same picture, is that true? Mm-hmm. Or do I actually want them to have a different picture that's adapted to all the stressors, environmental things, and made my cell more resilient? So actually, are we looking, when we reverse these things, have we actually taken away some of the resiliency of the cell? Do we not want our methylation markers to look the same as a 20-year-old, right? So we're measuring data that may not be right. Yeah. It's also very different from one cell to another, that our cells age at different levels and they have different capacities for changing. So I think we have to really look carefully at, do we even know what we're measuring? And when we take these people and we reverse their biologic age, has that been a good thing or not? We have no idea, right? We hope so, but we don't know. Yeah. So I think we have to say we just don't know the answers there. And I think probably the multi-omics testing where they're looking at at proteomics and metabolomics are probably the best. But even those, again, are going to be rapidly changing based on different things. Mm-hmm. So I think we are pretty unclear what we're looking at. Are we actually creating more harm than good? All these, the aging Olympic that everybody's all proud of. No. I don't know. And I don't do a lot of that testing in my patients. I do very, I do extensive lab testing, look at all the, their cardiometabolic markers and the things that I know are really very predictive of a good cardiovascular health, a good brain health. We do brain testing. But I don't give them, a data that says, oh, I'm sorry, you're 85, because I don't know that that's good. Yeah, I'm doing everything I can right now to try and make them better. Right. And I'm looking at all those things. I'm looking at those organ systems in a way that I can know where I can change. So I caution you guys, some of you guys love it. Fine. If it's a hobby and you love getting your age testing, do it as a hobby, but think of it probably no more as that, because so if it gives you joy, do it. To me, it gives me strife. And I don't find spending a lot of money on those tests is going to particularly probably be the thing that's going to make you live a long time.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you said something so important that I've repeated a few times myself, is that I don't think you'll find a centenarian around right now whose goal was to be a centenarian. They just
Yeah.
kind of did it, right?
Right.
What's interesting, what I do think we're seeing now, and maybe we're just seeing it because we see things differently than we used to, and maybe these people were always around, but we are seeing some people in their 80s and their 90s who are thriving exceptionally well, who are athletes, who are performing as if they were, let's say 30 years younger or something. And although even that 99-year-old woman who just won all the swim competitions in her age group, who didn't
Mhm.
start swimming till she was in her 60s or something,
Right.
I mean, she still moves, when she's on land, she's still moving like a much older person,
Right.
but she's accomplishing incredible stuff. And
And some of that, again, is adaptability, right? So
yeah,
my cells know I do need to move a little slower because, I've learned I don't want to trip and fall.
yeah,
Like I've learned through a lot of traumas, there's things I shouldn't have done, right? And I won't do them again. It
yeah,
took that. Well, my cells may be learning the same thing. You should be doing this a little differently. You should be moving a little bit different, maybe eating a little bit differently. And we need to listen to those messages. It's not as though we want to be old, but we actually also want to learn, and we want our bodies to adapt to that changes. So I don't want to do what I did when I was, in my 20s, and I tore my ACL 4 times, and I,
yeah.
broke my ankle, and I don't. For me right now, that would be a really bad thing to have to go through some of those things. When I was 20, it wasn't such a big deal. So we do kind of, unfortunately or fortunately, our bodies are learning and adapting, and we need to appreciate that. So that 90-year-old is maybe moving a little slower. That's probably what they need to be able to do, because their cells need to last longer and move on and not not undergo injuries.
Yeah. Well, and they're not going to repair in the same way.
Not
And
going to
yet,
repair, right?
but
Even if
yet,
we do everything right.
no, exactly. And yet these, we are seeing these people in much later decades being much more fit, which I do think is inspiring and
It is.
and fantastic. And so that,
And yet, so far, those are not the people who have been our biohackers, right? Because that wasn't even around, right, when they were young.
no,
So
they're
what got
typically
them
not
there
taking,
was,
yeah, they're not
I
taking
mean,
growth hormone. Like they're
yeah.
not doing those things.
No, I looked at my parents who lived. I mean, my dad lived to 93, very, very healthy until the very end. When he got cancer, and but he was at 80s climbing mountains. He never took a freaking supplement in his life. I mean, it was, despite my trying to get him to, but he had a lot of purpose. He took care of my kids. He raised my kids. He had a lot of purpose. He enjoyed life. He exercised because he liked to exercise. He was, he kept his mind sharp doing things. Those are the things that probably, if you talk to most of those people, that's what they're doing. And so let's not get so obsessed by this that we are destroying those things that make life happy.
100%. No, I'm 100% with you. Okay, cool. So our last section of this podcast, which I'm really excited about, is we were going to talk about repurposed drugs, and which I think is really fascinating, because there was one that I brought up, and there's one that I didn't really know that much about. And when you started like this list of benefits, and I'm sitting there with my jaw on the floor going, why isn't this in the water? Like, forget fluoride, which, by the way, shouldn't be in the water.
Should be
Right? Which should never be in the water. But why isn't this just being handed out like candy on every store, on every corner? So we're going to talk about, for sure, LDN and Amlexinox. And then if we have time, if we decide we're not all talked out, there's another one we're going to talk about. So I'm not going to name it in case we don't get to it, so people don't get upset. But let's start with LDN. Now, some of you who are listening to this are going to be sitting there going, well, duh, LDN, amazing. And the rest of you are going to be scratching your heads going, what is she talking about? So let's start there.
Yeah. So I hope even you guys who are LDN, you know all about it. Low dose naltrexone is what we're talking about. I hope that even you guys will learn something, because it's funny, when I really deep dived into low dose naltrexone, when I first started using it, I was like, wow, I didn't even know these things about naltrexone. But so first of all, what is a repurposed drug? So repurposed drugs are cool. And I actually thrive in repurposed drugs, because you can take a drug that's already been through, years of testing, and it's approved drug. So it's really, in general, its safety, it's been around, its safety profile has been well shown, well demonstrated. So, and it's been approved for a certain purpose. Because when you get a drug through FDA approval, you have to say, I am going to use this drug for this,
Right.
right? And yet, one of the things we do in my cellular medicine world is understand every pathway in the body, or as much as we can. I'm not so good at it, but Dr. Seeds knows them all. But, so understanding every pathway in the body. And so if I know, oh, this drug is approved for this, the reason is because it works on this pathway. I have another disease in this person that pathway is really screwed up. I can now take that drug, repurpose it, and use it in another place. So low-dose naltrexone was actually approved in 1984. So it's an old drug. So not low-dose, but naltrexone. So naltrexone was approved in 1984 at a dose of about 50 to 100 milligrams a day for treating opioid and drug and alcohol addiction.
Okay.
So what it did is it blocked the opioid receptors. People would drink. They wouldn't feel good. It wouldn't make them happy. So they would stop drinking. It kept them from drinking. So basically it was an antagonist of what are called opioid growth factors. And so it blocked these opioid growth factors. And so doing, it would block the effects of these good drugs on you. And so if I drank alcohol and I didn't feel any better, I lost my desire to drink. Okay. And so that's what the drug's been used for since 1984, and it's still used for. So at a 50 to 100 milligram dose. But interestingly, it was really this guy, what was his name? Can't remember, but he was a Harvard physician at New York State that actually was weaning his HIV patients down who are drug addicts, he was weaning them down off of naltrexone as they were getting better. And so he started using it in his clinical practice. And what he found is when he got to these low doses, so as he weaned them down from 50 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10, as they got to the low doses, they started having all these benefits. Like they felt really good. They actually had, less pain. They were happier. Their depression improved. Those who had other complications like gut issues and things like that were saying, I don't have these anymore. I feel so much better. And so it was, so then, a couple of doctors started actually, looking at a little bit more at all of its benefits. And they were like, oh my gosh, this drug really does have at this low dose, really significant benefits. So I think around 2007, a doctor by Dr. Smith, who was studying it in Crohn's disease, so in some of the inflammatory bowel diseases, started really looking at, and that was one of the first places it was used was inflammatory bowel diseases, and said, indeed, this drug, and the way, when they looked at how the low dose worked, it's pretty cool. So when you look at naltrexone, it has what are two racemic isomers. So basically there's always a left hand and a right hand. Yeah. The drugs and proteins and things like that. So there's a left-handedness and a right-handedness. So there was the delta and the levo form of naltrexone. And the delta racemic mixture that's in there blocked what are called toll-like receptors. And some of you guys may be familiar with toll-like receptors, but they're found on mast cells and inflammatory macrophages and microglial cells. And so when you blocked these toll-like receptors, it would block the overactivation of these microglial cells and macrophages and mast cells, and you would see a marked reduction in pro-inflammatory cytokines. So it beyond its opioid effects, it had this really marked effect to just lower inflammation dramatically, especially with neural stuff, right? Because when you have activated glial cells in the brain, we know that actually leads to a lot of other diseases, including dementias. So we really want to settle down activated microglial cells. That's one of the things that happens after you have a head injury, for instance. You get this microglial activation, so the secondary injuries that occur. So that's pretty cool. And then the levo form was an antagonist to the opioid receptors, right? And it has a small temporary opioid blockade. So basically, when you temporarily block the opioid receptor, right, and then you take the receptor out, your body produces all these more endogenous opioids. Mm-hmm. So as you blocked it and then it rapidly fell out of the receptors, you'd upregulate your own production of these endorphins and you'd feel really good. You'd feel happier. Your mood is better, but also endorphins are super important for our immune systems. So we know there's a very big link between endorphins and immune function. So think about endorphins are your natural peptides. They're produced in a lot of cells. They regulate cell growth, your immune function. And so that's where it really is helpful with the autoimmune diseases was really in this immune modulation by these endorphins being increased. So very cool that you get this rebound effect, and that rebound effect would affect all these opioid receptors that are in your gut, on your lymphocytes, in your brain. So really, you can use it for almost every disease.
Yeah.
If you have an autoimmune disease, if you have any kind of inflammatory disease, any type of arthritis, gut diseases, it's incredible for the gut, right? So anybody who's inflammatory gut diseases, this is a really good drug for. Cancer, and cancer patients, really beneficial in cancer. So there's and the only downside of this drug is if you take opioids, it can block their effect a little bit, right? Because I've temporarily blocked the opioid receptor, so I have a little bit less effect from my opioids. So if you're somebody who needs your opioids because you have chronic pain for some reason, then you would have trouble. What I try and do on those patients is still try and wean them, kind of get them to a point where I can wean down their opioids and get the low-dose naltrexone substituting for the opioids, which you can usually successfully do because it really does help pain.
That's
so,
amazing.
As Nat says, here's a drug that literally is super safe. There's zero downsides that I can think of coming to my head. Its only side effect is it does sometimes in people create really vivid dreams. And for some reason, those vivid dreams are oftentimes bad. I don't know why. It must be our way our brains work. I take this drug. When I first took this drug, I still kind of am tormented by some of the dreams I had. Now I find I dream more vividly, but they're not necessarily always bad. They're more interesting. So that's the only side effect. So sometimes what you'll do is wean up on the drug slowly to try and eliminate that effect, because it's the number one reason people stop it.
Because of the dreams. That's so interesting. And so how low dose is low dose? Like, are we talking under 10 milligrams a day or 5?
Yeah. So typically it can anywhere from like 0.001 milligram up to like 15 milligrams. But the more standard dose is about 4.5 milligrams. That's what works in most people. The microdose I'll use sometimes starting like when somebody is on opioids and I want to really try and wean them down off their opioids and wean them up. I'll start on what's called microdose LDN. That's those very low doses. But most people, you'll start at like 1.5 milligrams. You'll do that for a little bit. You'll go up to 3, and then you'll go up to 4.5. And 4.5 has been shown to probably be the standard dose that works on most people.
Okay.
As opposed to, again, naltrexone is 50 to 100 milligrams. So
so it's a whole different kettle of fish.
It's a whole different drug, basically, right?
Yeah, that's so fascinating.
So yeah, any of you guys, again, you do need a prescription for this drug. I don't know why. It's probably safer than a lot of supplements, but it's something to really consider. Any of you guys who are dealing with, COVID after effects or have immune mediated diseases or inflammatory diseases or arthritis or gut problems, you should be on this drug.
Yeah. No, I was telling you that my mom was having really, really terrible like muscular cramps in her feet and her legs. And plus she has arthritis. So, like her hands would cramp up. She would say she was having like an arthritis flare or something. And the LDN has made a massive difference for her.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah, and one of the reasons it'll help with like cramping and things like that is because of that microglial deactivation, like turning down the glial cells. Glial cells are neuroexcitatory, so you get tingling and cramps and neurogenic pain. So by turning down that microglial excitability, and there's not a lot of things that do that very well. So it really is an interesting drug. MS. So MS, you've got to turn down the microglial cell activity for MS. And that's a really important thing. So this is a really good drug for MS.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, guys, so lots of reasons to maybe think about it if it's something that you haven't explored yet. All right. Here's another one. Amlexanox.
So Amlexanox is one of my favorites. And it's actually
list.
Yeah, it's not well known out there. So a lot of you guys, even you really well read biohackers who know about LDN, probably have not heard about Amlexanox, and I don't hear it a lot. And yet it's a pretty cool drug. So Amlexanox is this anti-allergic, anti-inflammatory drug, and it works by mast cell stabilization and immune modulation. And also corrects some of the gene expression stuff. So it actually works even on a gene level. But It was previously known as a drug called Apthosol. And Apthosol was an oral paste used for mouth ulcers. So how painful mouth ulcers. This was a great drug for that. So it was used topically to treat these people who had recurrent mouth ulcers, and it was great. And it stopped being sold in the U.S. mostly because people are like, oh, well, it was banned in the U.S. It wasn't. It stopped being sold because there wasn't enough of a market for it, and the drug company basically stopped selling for it. It's still available in other countries. Japan is still widely used for a whole lot of purposes, including asthma, allergies, hay fever, conjunctivitis, mouth ulcers, things like that. So it's used a lot in other countries, particularly Asia. we can still get it here in the US, but you have to get it compounded here in the US. But instead of using it as an oral paste, because we're not treating mouth ulcers, we use it orally. And when you look, it basically is working on a lot of fronts. Number one, mast cell stabilizing, right? So remember that when we get these, all these immune reactions to things, we're releasing a lot of histamine and leukotriene mediators from the mast cells, and that brings in the neutrophils, and monocytes and these activated lymphocytes. And so we can turn that down. You guys all know about, mast cell activation syndromes and how debilitating those things are for people. And a lot of people have, even on a low level, have that. It's where, these kind of histamine reactions to things, be it foods, be it environmental, be it just stress. So by reducing mast cell activation, you can actually treat a whole lot of things. But it also inhibits something called Th17 cells, and that's really important for cancer. So it's really useful in cancer as well. And then it, like a lot of these other drugs for longevity, it also has some influence on apoptosis of abnormal cells and mTOR inhibition. So it's a mild mTOR inhibitor, so it might be something that is a really good choice because it's not completely inhibiting it yet, but it's slowing it down a little bit. Really, and it's probably where it's most researched, honestly, is in metabolic diseases. So obesity, diabetes. And that's because it stimulates lipolysis, mostly via activating AMPK, but really reduces insulin resistance. So anybody who's insulin resistant, this is a really good drug. It stimulates mitochondria, it lowers cholesterol. It reduces visceral fat a lot. And that's probably because visceral fat's so inflammatory driven. So if we can turn down inflammation, we can really help visceral fat. So it's been most widely used for weight loss because of that lipolysis effect. And honestly, I don't use it for weight loss very much. I use it primarily in my patients for its immune modulating effects. So I use it in my patients who have autoimmune diseases, arthritis, inflammatory diseases. I also use it in people who have a lot of allergy stuff. So any of you guys who have asthma, allergic rhinitis, horrible hay fever. This is a great drug if you have horrible hay fever, like seasonally, you just are a mess. This is a great drug for that because it really helps with these atopic conditions, or atopic dermatitis, people would get rashes, psoriasis, things like that. Super helpful for those people too. Really? And it's so the biggest side effect I see from people who I put on this drug is sometimes weight loss. And for some people that's fine because they're heavy, but for my patients they're not, right? They're not heavy, and so trying to keep them on this drug, which oftentimes makes them feel much better in the face. Like I have a guy who has rheumatoid arthritis, who's a pretty buff, muscular guy. He can't keep weight on this drug, but it markedly helps his arthritis. So we're always kind of in this balancing game of trying to keep weight on him. Even when he eats, he seems to have a lot of trouble keeping weight on. It doesn't lower appetite like things like semaglutide do. It just induces lipolysis. And so he really has a hard time. It's always when you're trying to put muscle on, you usually have to put a little fat on along with it. And so, he has trouble with that. But there's a great article I was telling Nat about briefly, published by a guy named John Loudon. It came out, 5 or 6 years ago. It's called Repurposing Naltrexone as a red light cure, showing for everything. And he actually has, cites a lot of research from neurodegeneration to coronary artery disease to arthritis to obesity. So it really is a cool drug. Again, very, very low side effect profile. About the only thing I've ever seen is the weight loss issue. Otherwise, people tolerate this drug really well. You don't see nausea. You don't see vivid dreams. So I will sometimes use it hand in hand with LDN. Sometimes I'll use one or the other, or in somebody who doesn't tolerate LDN. This is a really cool drug, guys. And I know most doctors know nothing about it. One of my passions is repurposed drugs. So I really am always looking at this stuff like, what can we do to take a drug? Or like these drugs, like in Japan, they use this drug a lot, right? So you can look at other countries that are using these drugs in different ways than we would use them here in the US. Because again, the US things get approved for one purpose, and say, they're doing it. It's working for them. Why wouldn't it work for us? We're not that different from the Japanese. So I love this drug. I use it a fair amount in my practice. And it's again, a lot of doctors don't know anything about it. Even your probably functional medicine doctors, a lot of them don't know about this, but it's something to kind of research a little bit and learn about.
So I have a question for you. So would you use this in someone who needs to lose weight instead of a GLP-1 agonist? Because I know you're a big fan of the GLP-1s for like a low dose for anti-aging purposes. So
I am, and I will say, the GLP-1 agonists are much more dramatic in their weight loss than Naltrexone is. Okay. But I have a lot of people who don't lose weight, or they stabilize on the GLP-1, right? Like they're like it's not working anymore, right? Yeah. So usually when the GLP-1 agonists stop working, it's because there is some other pathway that's inducing them maintaining fat. And that's usually something that's turned on in inflammatory, like Th17. Inflammation is upregulated in those people. And so and to me, that's a cue that there is more of an inflammatory phase going on here. Semaglutide is anti-inflammatory, but it works on a different way in helping the immune system from the GLP-1s on the lymphocytes. But this drug's working differently. And so I will then add this in, and it will really help push that weight loss back down. Again, I will oftentimes too try it in people who don't want the GLP-1 agonist because of the side effect profiles or things they've heard. But I am a fan of the GLP-1 agonists. I do think they are more robust in their weight loss than Amlexanox is. But again, Amlexanox is more probably the inflammatory driven weight loss. So people who have more inflammatory conditions, if you've got visceral fat, like if your fat's well distributed, it's probably a little bit less like an inflammatory state. People who have a lot of visceral obesity, those people are inflammatory, and they actually they'll lose weight well with Amlexanox. But it is something to keep in mind if you're one of those people who's taking semaglutide and you're like, this drug stopped working for me, right? This isn't a good add-on.
Nice. Okay. Well, I think we have time for one more. Do you?
Sure.
Okay. So our last candidate for discussion today is tesofensin, which I've seen in my communities. I've seen a few people have a really tough time with it. So I came in here hot saying, to Dr. Yurth, well, I don't know about this tesofensin thing, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, actually not. It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But there's caveats with this one,
there's
right?
Caveats, right. Like everything. Right. It's not for everybody, and you have to kind of know what you're doing with it. So tesofensin tesofensin was discovered. I can't remember what year it was. It was quite some time ago, and they actually discovered it by this company Neurosearch, who was studying drugs for treating Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and tesofensin came out as a candidate because it's working on some of the brain receptors that are affected, particularly in Parkinson's, because it's a dopamine agonist. So they said, this would be helpful for Parkinson's. So they tried it. And the problem was that people who had Parkinson's lost so much weight on it that it wasn't a viable drug. So they abandoned its use in those people because a lot of those people, it's hard to keep weight on them anyway. And it wasn't overly effective. It was helpful, but it wasn't like this dramatic effect. And the side effect profile was too high because of the weight loss that was induced. So the way it works is it's what's called a triple uptake inhibitor. So those of you who take antidepressants, usually those are like serotonin uptake inhibitors or maybe dopamine agonists, but there's not a lot of triple uptake inhibitors. So something that's actually blocking, reuptake of dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline. Wow. So tesofensin blocks all three of those. And it's one of the only things that really that does that. And so I have a lot of people who, when I look at neurotransmitters and urine metabolites and things, they're low in dopamine, they're low in serotonin, and so I like it for that reason. And it's really helpful for those people, anxiety, depression, poor libido. When you upregulate dopamine a little bit, like people who have really, particularly women who have low libido, if you can give them a little more dopamine, sometimes it really markedly improves libido. I told Nat, I said, this is the one drug that I honestly really liked the way I felt on it. And it's not a lot of things I say I had a dramatic effect from this. I was like, to me, I felt so much better on this that I was like, this is a little scary. I felt so much better on it. So,
yeah.
And I don't really have super low dopamine or I try things because I try things more so than I'm like, okay, I need this drug. I don't prescribe very much that I didn't try before just because I want to sort of see what effects I had, what did I like, what did I not like, so I can speak to my patients. But where it got then picked up is because of that weight loss, because of the Parkinson's patients that induced weight loss. So the weight loss crowd got a hold of, tesofensin. And it's approved in some other countries for this purpose. Primarily here in the US, it was used for kids who have what's called Prader-Willi syndrome, which is this horrible thing where these little kids just eat and eat and eat. And you can't stop them. Like they're 2 years old and you have to hide food from them. You have to lock cabinets. You have to lock their doors at night because they will just seek out food and they get obese. Like they're 3-year-old obese.
Oh my God.
And so tesofensin was used in that crowd because when you change the neurotransmitters, it really helped the disease. And I think it still is approved for that purpose, but nothing else. But it does induce weight loss, right? So because of this effect on the neurotransmitters, you get weight loss, you get fat loss specifically. You do feel increased energy when you block dopamine uptake and serotonin uptake. You feel your sex drive gets better. Men report better mood, better erections for men. There is improvement in glucose levels, insulin sensitivity. It does reduce appetite. So like semaglutide, one of its effects is it does reduce appetite, but it also increases resting energy expenditure. So it has a little bit of a stimulant effect that happens when you're changing the noradrenaline uptake, right? And you have higher levels of noradrenaline, you do feel more energy. And some people don't like it because they feel a little bit, racy, right? But it might be one of the more powerful weight loss drugs, honestly, that's out there. And is it better than semaglutide? I think semaglutide has all those other benefits that I really like. Tesofensine, probably not, right? It's probably a great drug for the right brain people who need it, who have, so I think if you're somebody who's, you're fat, you're depressed, you're sluggish, you've lost your zest for life, you have no libido, this is a really nice drug to potentially work with a physician and try, right?
Right.
And overall, it actually has its biggest side effect was increased blood pressure. So you have to be careful with that. And that's why actually as a drug, and I can't remember the name of the drug, but it's available in Europe as a drug where they mix tesofensine with an antihypertensive because it would raise blood pressure. So blood pressure was at a high dose was raised, I think about, it wasn't dramatic, but it was raised a little bit. So you have to watch that. Heart rate was increased about 8 beats per minute with tesofensine because it does have that stimulant effect. You do sometimes get a dry mouth when just like the serotonin uptake inhibitors will sometimes induce a dry mouth. You do sometimes get a dry mouth or some diarrhea and constipation with it. Again, that's the reduction in serotonin uptake. And again, that sort of angst feeling for some people. And I think that depends on what your noradrenaline levels are, right? So this is the drug where I use mostly in people who I feel like, okay, this is a person, you can almost sniff them out, right? You look at them and they're fat, they're sluggish, they're depressed, they're anxious. Those are the people I think this is a really nice drug to try in because it is working in so many factors there to help them.
Well, if it helps,
I don't think we should just abandon it, right?
No,
they just feel better, right? They just feel better. I mean, and I literally have some people who it is life changing for them, just like sometimes antidepressants are. And I think this is actually safer than some of the antidepressants. Now, will you have a rebound effect? I'm off this drug. I think I typically wean people off of it a little more slowly. So when they kind of hit ideal weight or I get their mood better, I'll wean them off a little bit slowly. But I haven't seen a big rebound in weight gain or in depression and anxiety as I have with some of the antidepressants. So I think overall, it's something that we should apply to the right people. Number one, I don't think it's going to work in everybody. If you've got great dopamine and serotonin levels, because that's the main way it's working, is this really going to be effect for you? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't, this may be a drug that's really effective. Now, you've got to be careful if you're taking an antidepressant. Adding this onto it, not a good idea.
I was just going to say, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
That's right. So if you're taking a serotonin uptake inhibitor and you add this to it, you could potentially increase serotonin too much, get what's called serotonergic syndrome. You have to be careful with that. So not for somebody who's taking an antidepressant. You'd have to take them off the antidepressant and put them onto this, but don't do both together.
Okay. All right. Well, there you have it, folks. We have 3 repurposed drugs, 7 anti-aging drugs or compounds, and 3 that we thought were superstars that maybe not so much. I mean,
keep open mind.
We're not going to throw them out yet,
throw them out.
but definitely, maybe cycle off them and try something different, like an SGLT.
Yeah, unless you love them and you feel great on them and you like.
And unless that they're hitting the mark for you.
And I'll be all for you.
Yeah, exactly. Did we forget anything? I thought we mentioned P16 as a measure of senescent cells, but that's not.
That's one of the things they look at in the mice studies. When they're doing these big studies, one of the markers that they're looking at is something called P16, which is one of the markers of senescent cells. You guys can't really test for it very easily. You have to be more in a setting that you can, or a research setting where you could test P16 levels through, like proteomic studies, things like that. But so it's a difficult marker to get. At some point, somebody's going to come up with a really good sort of senolytic looking at all these different factors, and we can sort of do one test that looks at things like P16, P53, things like that. So I do think that we'll get to that point where we can measure that senescent cell burden a little bit better. I don't know that we're there yet, but somebody will kind of come up with a really good test. Right now, they're just more available on a research setting basis, and that's where we've maybe hung our hat a lot on the anti-aging. On the biologic testing, age testing stuff, maybe a better marker is just going to be looking at some of these just very specific markers just to say, are we doing something in that capacity, right? But I would encourage you guys, there's a complete blood count and a complete comprehensive metabolic panel and a good cardio panel where you're looking at ApoB and ApoA and, and LP little a. Those go 90% of what you can figure out about your longevity, you can get from those things. And you're going to be spending $50 and not $300, $400. I don't even know what those tests cost anymore. But, on some of these really fancy testing, I think, it's a fancy testing up your alley and you think it's fun. And this is your gig to make sure you want to be in the age Olympics, go for it. That's, it's funny. I have a friend who's like, these people are spending all this money on, all this stuff. And I go, you spend a lot of money on your horse. I wouldn't spend money on a horse, so we all, you choose what you want to spend your money on. And I have no beef with people who want to spend $1 million on their longevity. That's great. But maybe you don't need to either. If that's not something that you love.
Well, and I think it's also just keeping it in balance, right? It's a little bit of what you said before, keeping it in context. They are continually doing more research. I know that one of the companies is going to be coming out with biological age clocks by organ system,
right,
which I think will give us some really good insight, even in terms of maybe where to focus. Maybe your cardiovascular, so your heart is something you have to focus on, or your brain. And is it going to give us hard data that is incontrovertible? Even then, probably not. But I think it'll maybe directionally start to.
Yeah, I may even disagree with you a little bit there,
really?
And I think that's still going to come back down to looking more at the cell, right?
Yeah, so and which you can do through lab work. Yeah, no, for sure.
Lab work, and or that's what Dr. Goodenough's tried to do with his prodrome scan now too, is look systematically at peroxisomal function, mitochondrial function. So we actually looking at these markers for do you have healthy mitochondria? Do you have healthy peroxisomes? Is your methyltransferase system working well? I think it's going to come back down because what ultimately is failing is the cell. It's not like all of a sudden your liver fails. Something's happening at the cellular level that is affecting all your organ systems, just some organ systems more. If you're more mitochondrial dependent, your heart, your brain, then they get affected more rapidly. So I think it's really going to come down to looking at more of these cellular systems. And I do think Dr. Goodenow, he keeps adding to his prodrome scan test where we can look at things. I mean, that's what his goal is to say, can we pick apart the cell and say, where are you failing at the cellular level? If we can figure that out, you're going to figure out all the other stuff.
Yeah, his scan test is something else. I mean, that if you can find, you're one of the few doctors. There's a few.
Yeah, they're so hard to read.
It's a tough test to read, but he offered last year. We did a brain reset program with Dr. Goodenow in my community, and about 24 people jumped on it, and he offered them a prodrome scan at the beginning. They did a 30-day. I mean, it was a hell of a supplement program. I'm telling you now, everybody had 12 bottles of stuff they were measuring out 3 times a day. But, all the people, I think there were 24 people signed up for it. They all did it. And then he redid the prodrome scan. And then he, as a group, went through everybody's scan. I was blown away by the information
right?
Comes out with, and so this is not you can just look at it and go,
it's not a test you guys can order and just look at. I mean, it honestly, he's a good friend, and he literally, I still have to call him and go, okay, this makes no sense to me. It's
and he just rattles it off. He was like, and everybody needed creatine.
Well, he's
at the
brilliant.
End of the day, everybody needed creatine.
Everybody needs creatine. Everybody needs plasmalogens.
Yeah, plasmalogens, creatine. No, actually, he actually was less bullish on plasmalogens than he was on the creatine.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer everybody needs creatine too.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. So anyway, I mean, that's actually a really interesting test. And I know that you are, like I said, you're one of the few physicians who can actually.
Yeah, we have a sort of roundtable discussion group we do every month with him, of physicians who are sort of trained in prodrome scans. And so we're all still learning from him, but it's always enlightening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and he's always learning. Didn't he do a roundtable last night on MS?
On MS. Yeah. It was actually, it wasn't like, he does these monthly, if you guys are interested, he does these, kind of more for the layperson. Last month was cardiovascular. This month was MS. And he explains these diseases in ways that you guys, you'll really understand why is high cholesterol good, not bad. Why is MS not an autoimmune disease? It's actually a disease of the oligodendrocytes, metabolically dysfunctional. And so really good. And then the same month he does a roundtable with the physicians where we go kind of deeper dive into it. But I love the direct to because and he works with this girl, Victoria, who kind of brings it, always keeps bringing him back down to a sort of a nice level for all of us. Yeah, I encourage you guys to look at those through Prodrome, these roundtables he's doing on different diseases. Next month's autism, which is actually really interesting too, when you look at sort of the autism and autism spectrum disorders and how those are cellular dysfunctions that are actually really similar to things like MS.
Yeah. No, and it's like, basically, as you said, it comes down to the cell. Comes down to the cell, comes down to the cell, always comes down to the cell. So if your cells are healthy, everything else is going to.
That's exactly right. So that's where you've got to look at the cellular level, not so much even at the organ level or, beyond that.
100%. All right. Dr. Yurth, where can people find you and learn more? We could keep going. I'm sure I could open up another little Pandora's box here and down we would go. But in the interest of your time,
so
you're a passionate educator.
I so appreciate everything you do, Nat, because I think you're one of the few people in this world that always is talking kind of sensibly. Not everybody is. It's always nice to, I always listen to your podcast going, refreshed that you sort of, you always bring things down to, let's look at this in a very sensible fashion as opposed to getting on these bandwagons all the time. So I really appreciate that in your community. So you guys, one of my big passions is teaching, and because I will never get my clinical practice. So that's Boulder Longevity Institute. If you go to boulderlongevity.com, you can sign up, you can get consults there. But, if you really want to just kind of learn more, along with the stuff Nat's teaching, we have an academy called Human Optimization Academy. So if you go to bli.academy, you can go there, sign up. We do these Q&As. My group is as smart. You guys will fit perfectly in because it's a really smart group of people who ask really hard questions, and we cover all sorts of cool stuff, new peptides, new, stuff that's just kind of hot off the box. And, so that's a really fun group. And we put out educational material all the time, based on some new literature or things. And then we have these Q&As that are super, honestly, I'm always completely just blown away at the questions I get asked. So join that academy. That's great. You can follow me at Dr. Yurth on Instagram. I'm not nearly as prolific as a lot of Instagrammers, but I try to throw things in when
it's
I
quality content. Let's be clear. This is not about massive volume.
Please join Human Optimization Academy if you guys want, if you want to, interested in seeing us, just boulderlongevity.com, otherwise bli.academy for the academy. And appreciate you guys listening to us for an hour and a half.
I appreciate you talking to us for an hour and a half. Thank you so much, Dr. Yurth. This has been a pleasure and long overdue.